We're live, Teresa.
Great. Welcome to this webinar on the financial and policy angles of our new report on the complex topic of chemicals in recycled material. And if you're new to us, ChemSec is an environmental NGO aiming to reduce the use of hazardous substances in products by cooperating with companies, highlighting good examples and opportunities, and this report is no exception. And with me today, I have Dr. Anna Lennqvist to take you through the key outcomes in general and the financial aspects in particular. And in addition, we will also hear Tia Sletten from FTech, who will describe the methodology behind the financial analysis and how we were able to reach these conclusions. And later on, I will present to you our key recommendations to policymakers at the end. We will hope to have some time for a few questions. We encourage you to put them down in the Q&A section here in Zoom. And to help us with the technical details and moderating any questions, we have the assistance of my colleague Peter Pierrot. If you think that this short webinar doesn't give you enough information, I encourage you to sign up for our next webinar, the 30th of March, where we will elaborate in more depth and include the parts that we don't mention today. So the invitation will come soon in our newsletter. So we decided to make this report after having experienced information gaps leading to the lack of incentives to produce more high quality recycled material, fulfilling the requirements that brands put on all the materials that they use. If this knowledge is not available, of course, this will also lead to less investments in this area, hampering the clean and resource-efficient innovation of technologies that will be fundamental for a successful circular economy. This report is an attempt to clarify the main roadblocks, find opportunities for companies, and guide policymakers to enable this progress. And with that, I'd like to hand over this to Anna.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I'm not sure what you see when you see this picture. I've learned that people see it very differently. Many see it as a smart way to use old tires to grow salad. To me as a toxicologist, though, I get a little bit worried because I know that these tires most likely contain quite a large volume share of hazardous PAHs. And I think this illustrates quite well the challenges in front of us as a society moving into a circular economy. Because when we try to close the loop and use waste for production of new products, we spread hazardous chemicals in a new and uncontrolled way. And this is something that more and more companies are getting aware of. And as manufacturers are responsible for the chemical content of their products, they are becoming reluctant to use recycled materials. This is one of several reasons why recycling levels are still very low, and why use of virgin materials still increases. In this report, we investigate the issue of hazardous chemicals in a circular economy from many different angles. We look at levels of hazardous chemicals in recycled materials and how they accumulate over time over the recycling cycles, and that they can remain in recycled materials long after production and use of this chemical in new materials have ceased. An interesting and new area is about how to better track chemicals through the life cycle of a material. A number of ideas and technologies are presented for how to do this, however, still on a pilot scale. And in this report, we use two materials as main examples. One is plastic packaging and another is textile. And these are both materials that are highly present in our daily lives and that often become waste after a relatively short time. They are also known to be chemical intensive in terms of production and known to be associated with a number of hazardous chemicals. And while recycling has been available for plastics since the 1970s, recycling of textiles is still in its infancy. So looking at what we found in this report, we must conclude that recycling levels are still low. On a global level, about 10% of plastic packaging is being recycled, while the same figure for textiles is less than 1%. And there are several reasons for this, as I said, but one of them is the presence of hazardous chemicals, or the likeliness of the presence of hazardous chemicals that makes the recycled materials less attractive and unusable for a number of applications. In this report, we go through different recycling methodologies and compare them from a number of different aspects, including how they deal with hazardous chemicals. And the only large-scale commercial recycling method today is so-called mechanical recycling, where the material is shredded or grinded into smaller pieces, while the chemical composition remains the same, including the hazardous chemicals in those materials. So we also looked into the different technologies under the umbrella term chemical recycling. And these techniques may in the future be able to recycle some material and at the same time take out the hazardous chemicals. However, these technologies have a number of disadvantages, including that they are very expensive and very energy consuming. So it must be concluded that it will not be possible to put the main bulk of the materials we want to recycle through these energy consuming processes, but they might possibly be used in specific cases. And as such, the main remaining option to keep hazardous chemicals out of the circular economy while continue using mechanical recycling as the main recycling technology, it is to stop using these hazardous chemicals in materials in the first place. But today we want to focus on a brand new financial analysis that was made for this report, because we wanted to investigate the financial opportunity that could arise if hazardous chemicals were no longer a barrier to increase recycling. And this work was done by Thea Sletten, who will soon speak, and her colleagues. And this was a complicated task we gave them. We're aware of that. And there is no such data available that can directly answer those questions. But we needed to build market scenarios and make assumptions. And I want to emphasize that it was us at ChemSec that wanted to set the scenarios at 5, 15, and 30% increase in recycling if hazardous chemicals were no longer an issue, while it was the work for Thea and her colleagues to translate that into money. And by that, I hand over to her to explain more what they have done.
Thank you, Anna. So, well, recycling, of course, has obvious environmental benefits, which makes it worthwhile activity in its own right. For this project, we wanted to explore a different side, the financial upside of the recycling activities, and how phasing out hazardous chemicals can be a potential stepping stone for expanding the financial opportunities within the recycling sector. So what I would start by highlighting is that we are not looking here at overall what is called socioeconomic cost to society. For example, we are not included things like capital cost, operational costs for the recycling companies, and we have not included or monetized any of the environmental benefits or benefits to human health. So in other words, this is a market analysis and should be interpreted as such. And this is a short webinar, so I will not be able to go into details on all the underlying analytical work that went into this, but I would like to give you kind of a brief overview of the general principle and considerations that is underlying the analysis. I will also touch briefly upon some of the challenges we met and which feeds into how the results can be interpreted. So firstly, to put it in a very short manner, our analysis could be summarized as investigating how much material gets recycled if we do nothing, how much recycling can be achieved if we do act, and what is the value of the additional recycled materials produced as a result of action taken. Next slide, please. So this sounds simple enough. So, but as Anna mentioned, we have been looking into two material streams. So that was plastic packaging as well as textiles. So our starting point was that we needed to create what we call a baseline, which is to create a projection of what will happen if we do nothing. And here we created a link between the use of virgin materials, the generation of waste, as well as recycling rate. And this was mapped out using information that we gathered through review of literature and also interviews with stakeholders. And what we found was that the current market of recycling and recycling rates, as well as the virgin materials, etc., are quite well documented. However, when you're creating projections, in particularly far into the future, uncertainties are unavoidable. So one of the things we did to try to kind of explore a bit further and see what happens if you vary some of these assumptions, that we did develop multiple baseline projections to reflect the uncertainties in consumption of virgin material, waste material available for recycling, the recycling rates, and also the price or the market value of these materials. So for this, unfortunately, the textile recycling market we found that to be too immature to make kind of any meaningful projection at this point. So what I will do is that I will focus on the work we did on plastic packaging for now. So one of the key points that we included in our analysis is how the development of the consumption or the use of plastic packaging will develop over time. So we do know that there are aims in the EU to reduce the use of plastic packaging. And also there is a consumer demand for less of this plastic packaging material, which may play an important role. It is therefore one of the scenarios that we have a clear decline in the use, which will also follow into less waste material kind of available for recycling. On the other hand, the recycling rates are expected to increase and potentially quite significantly. And this is also, of course, it's set out by the European Commission on achieving a 50% recycling rate by 2025 and 55% by 2030. And both of these goals are integrated into the baseline. In terms of the value of the market materials, we do know that plastic prices are highly volatile, and even more so the prices for the recycled materials. So what we've seen is that, like, historically, the recycled materials had lower prices than the virgin materials, but over later years this has not always been the case. So it's clear that this is varying a lot, and also what we found in various sources had reported quite different prices for the recycled materials. So one of the things we did here was that we included quite a large range that we tested for the price of the recycled materials from between 50% of the virgin price up to 100% of the virgin price. So based on this information, we developed our baseline from 2021 to 2050, and we found that annual value of the recycled plastics that would be placed on the market during this period would expect it to be around 5 to 15 billion per year. So quite a substantial market. You can go one back, please, I think. There you go, thanks. So if we come back to our kind of core questions that I showed you in the beginning. So we have our what happens if we do nothing. So now the question is, what happens if we do something? So the first part of this is that we needed to figure out how much recyclable material is discarded, or basically if it might not even be collected for recycling. And what we looked at here, or that we found, was that the reported recycling rate is typically the share of the collected waste that is collected for recycling. And for plastic packaging, this is around 40%. However, for the analysis we were going to do, we needed to also find out what were discarded or not collected in other parts. So we needed to look at actual recycling rates. And we found this in a recent study by Material Economics. And they found that of these of the material that is actually collected specifically for recycling, only 50% of that is actually recycled in the EU. So in total, it was found that if you look at the starting point, which is all end-of-waste plastics, only 8 to 10% ends up actually being recycled. So in other words, the actual recycling rates are fairly low, and parts of this is due to hazardous chemicals. The materials that are not recycled represents a lost resource, and then on the flip side, we then have a potential market opportunity if these materials could be utilized. And this was where the main challenges appeared. So yes, there is clear evidence that shows that hazardous chemicals represent a barrier for recycling, but unfortunately, it has not been possible to isolate the volume of this material that is not recycled due to the presence of hazardous chemicals. And this information gap became quite apparent both through review of literature, but also through the consultation with stakeholders. So what we do know is that there are many barriers contributing to the lower recycling rate. So it's clearly unrealistic to assume that removing hazardous chemicals will resolve everything. And in the absence of this information on how large role the chemicals play in this, some assumptions had to be made, as Anna already pointed out. So after discussing with ChemSec, we concluded that the most transparent approach in this case was to create some examples where we use some preset numbers for the increase in the recycling rates that could potentially be achieved. And I would like to underline that we're not claiming that this will be the exact rate that will be achieved, but we found that this will give a more realistic picture than just presenting the value of all materials that is not recycled. And another way of also the benefit of kind of choosing a range in this setting is that this example then can also kind of use as an indication or a loose interpretation of potential level of ambition in actions that triggers increases in the recycling rate. So if you can take me to the last slide, please. So the key takeaways from our analysis is that the plastic packaging recycling market, it's big. It's a €1 billion market already, and it is increasing. So there are currently quite low recycling rates, which means that there is a large unrealized market potential. If the recycling rate could be increased between 5% percentage points to 30 percentage points from 2025, we're looking at a market opportunity of between 1 to 8 billion euros. So even a small share can result in a potential sizable market opportunity in our case. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tia. That was really interesting. You can turn to the next slide, please. I think we can all agree that a circular economy is the future, but that the way to make it successful is complex. We need to use less resources and produce less waste that ends up in the environment, landfills, etc. And there are really two main points in the lifespan of a product to address this: at the end, when products become waste, and at the point of production. And only addressing one of these to solve the problem will not get us circular. A key element here is to ensure that new products can be recycled without contaminating the material streams. And then we need to take care of the waste we produce, both the old and the new. Some can indeed be recycled into new products in a reasonable way, but some cannot and should not. And this problematic part of the waste is currently prohibiting us to use the good quality, high value waste materials. And as we can see from the conclusions in the report, there is a huge market potential if we are able to address the issue of hazardous chemicals in products and waste properly. And for this, we need regulation. To highlight some of the things that policymakers need to prioritize and work on, we've gathered some recommendations and I want to share them with you. If you could switch slides, please. Thank you. So we know that problematic substances in waste is a roadblock for recycling, and therefore policymakers need to take action to regulate the phase out at a much higher speed than before. And in addition, hazardous chemicals must be included when we regulate circular design, sustainable products, and other initiatives. If recycled material is to be used by brands to a large extent, regulation must ensure that the same requirements apply for virgin and recycled material. And this also means to not approve derogations in chemical regulation. Another important aspect here is to make sure that imported articles are regulated in the same way. The next point is about transparency and traceability. So we need to know the chemical content and that this information must be available throughout the supply chain and into the waste phase. And yes, we do see progress here, but there is still a long way to go. I also want to emphasize that the recycling phase of product and material must be included and considered in all socioeconomic and impact assessments. This is currently not the case, and neglecting to see this angle gives a skewed result of the assessments and therefore might also give different outcomes. There needs to be a system in place that rewards frontrunners to balance the cost premium that often comes along with this. And here I want to be clear that it should also include the recycling companies, a key part of the chain. And the Commission mentions this reward thinking in the recent chemical strategy, and we encourage this to be ambitious so that we can reach a more level playing field. So my final remark is to be very careful when it comes to definitions. So-called recycled goods should be made of materials derived from waste, and you should be able to prove a physical link. There's a lot of ongoing work right now that revolves around this. And one tangible thing that can be done is to introduce definitions of chemical recycling technologies in the EU waste legislation to increase clarity and to exclude fuel production. So there is a lot to be done, but clearly also a lot to be gained by setting the stage properly. And I trust that we now have a few minutes for some questions from the people attending. And Peter, I don't know if you have been able to catch some questions in particular that you want to pose to Anna, Tia, or me?
Hi, yes, we have a couple of questions here. So the first one is, what would be needed to do this kind of analysis for other market sectors? I mean, this time we looked at textiles and plastic packaging, right? So I guess that is for you, Tia.
Yeah. Well, I think it needs to be what we found with textiles already, that if the market is very immature, it's difficult to even get the starting point of what we call the baseline, right? So I think it needs to be, if the market is well documented, it's mature enough that we have data to at least describe the current situation and make some meaningful projections for the future. But as you saw here, even for a quite mature market as plastics and recycling of plastics, there is challenges related to linking the hazardous chemicals. How large role does that play? So Of course, we can do a similar type of analysis where you use examples, but if you want really robust analysis, I would say there's some information gaps that needs to be filled almost in regardless of which sector you're looking at.
Okay, thanks. And a bit of a follow-up question to that is, did you identify other barriers for the recycling rates to be so low? We mentioned chemicals, of course, but are there any other barriers you see?
I think the barriers, maybe Anna or Teresa.
Yes, I can take that one. I mean, commonly mentioned barriers are, one thing is infrastructure to collect and get these materials out to different facilities. Another are more technical related, so it's difficult to recycle some types of materials that are composed of different materials, so blends or multi-layer plastic packaging, for example. Another barrier is also price. Right now, the oil price has been very low, so it's been cheaper to use to make virgin plastics than to use recycled plastics, actually. So I think those are three often mentioned barriers.
Okay, great. So Teresa, what type of hazardous materials are you aiming at eliminating for use? Is it all hazardous materials or only those posing a risk during use? And in the latter case, how do you assess that risk?
That's a great question that we very often get. And here, I think it's really important to think about the risk aspect of using hazardous chemicals. Because when we see materials in the circular perspective, they all will eventually end up as waste, and we have no idea what they will be used as after the waste phase. So when we talk about using something safely, saying that it has no exposure in this particular use, that is not the case after it's become waste. So this is very important to take into consideration. Therefore, we find that all the discussion about risk management and safe levels and lack of exposure becomes less relevant when we talk about circular economy. Of course, when we talk about which chemicals to regulate, the legislation today looks mainly at the substances of very high concern under REACH, even though we, of course, promote our own sin list of chemicals. They fulfill the criteria to be on the candidate list, to be quite technical, but yeah.
Thanks, Teresa. What do you see as currently being the biggest problems in terms of the transparency that you discussed for the policy recommendations?
There are several issues there. Most of them are mentioned in the report. I think the first one is that it is very difficult for brands to find out the chemical composition of their own products. Very often when we talk to even progressive companies, this is the main problem for them. They ask their suppliers what the products contain and they don't get the full information. So if we don't have that initial transparency, there is no way that we can then transmit the information further on. So I would say that that is the first thing to deal with, to increase the transparency at the first stage. Then, of course, we need to develop technology that is suitable for different types of products. And that I think that could look very different. And we have some very illustrative examples in the report on how to do this. And then this information needs to be transmitted in a reasonable way to recyclers so that they can make use of it and possibly even further make use of other information that could be contained in this information format.
Teresa, can you please elaborate on why hazardous chemicals in the plastic from packaging makes it impossible to use the plastic material again? So packaging can have a very short lifespan, and their current chemical composition shouldn't make it impossible to current regulation to reuse them soon after collection.
I think that depends very much on what what types of packaging we're talking about. What I find very interesting with packaging in particular is that it does have a short lifespan. And this means that we don't necessarily have the big issue with the legacy chemicals that we do with other products. And therefore I see a big potential here to make changes. So if we can phase out substances that many brands find problematic, then we will be quite soon able to reuse a lot more. So I think this particular group of products is especially interesting for quick change, I would say. And I can see now that we have reached the end of our session here. And clearly we cannot answer all your questions, but feel free to contact us and we will try to answer your questions afterwards.
I think we can go on a little bit, maybe for a couple of minutes, and just try and make it a few more questions. What do you think? Should we try that? Yeah.
Did you have some questions in particular?
Yes, there are several questions left. That's why I think we should extend the time a little bit.
Okay, a few minutes then.
Yeah, a few minutes. And I mean, those who don't have the time, they can drop off, obviously. How could recyclers use the information on chemical content without increasing the cost of recycling and upsetting the competitive balance with virgin material?
Should I start? Anna can fill in. That is not a question that we are best suited to answer. And I think this is really important that we have a dialogue where the recyclers are part of it, because this is what I often see in the policy discussions, that you ask people in one field to answer a question for another. I am a strong advocate for dialogue and that we should solve these issues together. And recyclers can't solve it on their own, and we can't solve it, and policymakers can't solve it alone. So we should be in the room together looking at different solutions. But it's very true that they need to have the financial incentives to produce this highly attractive material to a reasonable price. And of course, here we see the importance of investors as well. So I don't have the clear answer for you, but I think that dialogue is where we need to start. Anna, do you have something to add here, or?
No, good answer.
Okay, last question. Who do you think would not recycle plastics due to presence of hazardous chemicals? That's actually a good question, but I think consumers would not know where hazardous chemicals would be. Therefore, do you think about recycling companies to differentiate between material with or without hazardous substances?
I'd really like to answer this one, if that's okay.
Yeah, yes, please go ahead.
Because I think this is really where we see a shift. It's true that consumers don't see the chemical content as such today, but that knowledge will increase. And I am absolutely certain, after speaking to so many brands about this, that they know the problem and they don't want to buy the materials if they don't know the content. And this is where the financial potential is at that Tia was talking about. Of course, nobody will recycle a material that they cannot sell. That speaks for itself. There needs to be a market opportunity for them in order to do that. And this is what we are trying to address with this report. So it is a question with the answer that is rather complex, I would say.
Okay, thank you. So do you want to say goodbye and conclude, Teresa?
Yes. Also, I want to encourage you all, if you find this interesting and want to know more and have more specific details on what we talked about today, but also the rest of the report, you should look out for our next webinar that we have scheduled for the 30th of March. And with that, I'd like to thank you, Anna and Tia, and also Peter, for your contributions today. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.